there is no position that is American, and therefore one can be accused of being anti-American. Every position, it seems to me, needs to be debated. So anybody calling anyone else anti-American is just issuing a meaningless political insult, and I don't take it seriously.
Anti-American is one term that's been used to describe my guest, Dr. Robert Jensen, who's been a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin since 1992. Jensen has described himself as a radical activist, a feminist, a Christian atheist, and an anti-capitalist who supports the ideals of socialism and democracy. I first became aware of Dr. Jensen when I took one of his introductory journalism classes in 2007. He was outspoken, opinionated, political, and not afraid to take on controversial topics. And Jensen has generated a lot of controversy, having written books and articles on subjects such as religion, pornography, race relations, and the hypocrisy of celebrating Thanksgiving. Following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Jensen wrote a highly controversial opinion piece for the Houston Chronicle. After calling the attacks reprehensible, Jensen wrote that they were, quote, no more despicable than the massive acts of terrorism, the deliberate killing of civilians for political purposes that the U.S. government has committed during my lifetime, end quote. Earlier this year, Jensen wrote another opinion piece for the Houston Chronicle, also critical of U.S. foreign policy. I began our conversation by asking Jensen about this piece. I'm Dustin Hall from dustinhall.org, and let's get to the interview I recorded with Dr. Robert Jensen via Skype from his office at the UT Austin School of Journalism. Well, Dr. Jensen, welcome to the program. I appreciate you being on.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. And so I wanted to get started. I wanted to talk a little bit about this opinion piece that you wrote that ran in the Houston Chronicle, among other places. And I guess what looked like sort of prompted the piece was the film Zero Dark 30. There had been some discussion about whether or not there were some inaccuracies in the film regarding the use of torture in gathering intelligence and the hunt for Osama bin Laden. I think that was kind of your starting point with the piece. I'm wondering if you could tell for us, for people who have not read the piece, what kind of was your thesis, or what was the argument you were trying to get across there?
Sure. Zero Dark 30 is, of course, a film about the CIA's hunt for Osama bin Laden. And one of the controversial aspects of the film was whether or not it presented CIA torture of prisoners in a positive light, suggesting that perhaps without torture we would never have gotten Osama bin Laden. So there's a great debate about, number one, how effective is torture? Number two, how important was torture in the intelligence trail that led to Osama bin Laden? And those are important questions. I don't want to minimize the importance of discussing torture. Just to be clear, I'm against torture. I think torture cannot be justified in moral terms, and I think the CIA's use of torture was illegitimate, as well as other agencies around the world that use torture.
Right, so which you do mention in the article.
Yeah, we'll get that clear right away. I'm not a torturer. But what struck me as I was watching the movie was how the larger political context dropped out. For instance, since 9/11, we've not only been involved in a hunt for bin Laden, we've been involved in two invasions of countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. I think both are ill-advised. I think both were fundamentally immoral, and I think clearly the Iraq War was illegal. Both have been fought with methods that target civilians by the nature of those methods, especially things like drone attacks and saturation bombing. In other words, the profound moral questions about those U.S. invasions kind of got washed away in the movie, and we're forced to train our attention on this one question of torture. And again, while torture is a crucial issue, I think it's more important that we think about the context within which all this is going on. The way the U.S. routinely uses its military power to, I would say, subordinate other parts of the world, especially the energy-rich regions of the Middle East, and the strategic reasons the U.S. does that. In other words, there's a whole set of questions that need to be raised in the United States, and which unfortunately are never raised. And I find them far more morally problematic. This was designed to suggest that we need to expand the scope of our inquiry into these questions about U.S. intelligence, U.S. military power, in fact, about the role of the U.S. in the world just generally.
Right. And so also you had written, I know people may be aware that after 9/11 you had written also in the Houston Chronicle an opinion piece kind of along those same lines. And I'm wondering if you can tell me if the two of those, if you notice any kind of link between those, or if you've noticed any kind of change in American foreign policy in that area since writing that 2001 piece.
Yeah, in a sense, you can look at U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and Central Asia in the scope of post-1945 to today. And in some sense, U.S. foreign policy has not changed in significant ways. After World War II, when the United States emerged as the dominant power in the world, it understood that the flow of oil and the flow of oil profits was going to be crucial to who governed the world. And the United States made some very clear moves to put itself in that position of dominance. So in general terms, U.S. foreign policy has been pretty consistent to try and dominate the political and economic decisions being made in the Middle East. Now, the strategic means to do that, of course, has changed over time. The United States has used what you could call surrogates in the Middle East, other nations to do its bidding. Israel is first on the list, but Arab countries as well. Saudi Arabia, a longtime U.S. ally. Egypt, post-1979. Jordan at various times. Iraq, depending on what time you're talking about. So the United States has, over the course of the last 6 decades, stitched together a strategy for trying to dominate the politics of the Middle East. That hasn't changed. The way it's done it has changed. Ever since 9/11, when there was a space open because of public outrage over those attacks, the Bush administration first and later the Obama administration pursued certain policies, most notably the ill-fated invasion of Iraq, to try and extend and deepen that American domination. That was, of course, by any measures, a complete failure. By moral or practical measures, a complete failure. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, I think, equally a failure, one that the Obama administration has taken longer to extract itself from. But all of this is part of a concerted effort by the United States to control the politics of that region. And in that sense, nothing's changed. As citizens of the United States, I feel it's our obligation to scrutinize the policies of the government, and when we find them inconsistent with our own moral principles, to object. That's what I did right after 9/11, when it was clear that the U.S. was going to use those attacks as a pretext to expand its power, to attempt to expand its power in those regions. And I feel the same way today. What's striking about the last decade is that those voices, predominantly from the anti-war movement, turned out to be accurate in their counsel, and yet we still ignore those voices. Policymakers in the United States pay no more attention to the anti-war movement today than they did 10, 12 years ago. And so that's what's changed, is we have more and more evidence that this course of action is not only immoral but ineffective, yet policymakers continue to pursue it.
What did you take, going back to that 2001 opinion piece that you wrote, what did you take from the controversy that stemmed from that? I know, according to the Austin Chronicle, even the then president of your university, the University of Texas, made some remarks disparaging your article. According to the quote I have here, he said he was disgusted by your article. He called you a fountain of undiluted foolishness on issues of public policy, and of course he was not alone. What did you take away from the controversy from that 2001 piece? What did that teach you, if anything?
Well, I don't think it taught us anything new, that when a country critique the policies of a country, you open yourself up to criticism. That's appropriate. Politics is about give and take, about criticism. If you do that in the immediate aftermath of a national crisis, such as the attacks of 9/11, you can expect that criticism to be even more intense. Again, nothing unusual about that. If there's a general consensus in a culture to go to war, for instance, and you offer an alternative and a critique of that rush to war, you should expect to be criticized and criticized quite sharply. So all of that's, I guess, pretty predictable.
In retrospect, go ahead.
No, the controversy at the university is slightly different because the university president should be upholding the university as a place for the expression of a wide range of opinions. It was unfortunate that the president chose not to do that, but in fact to offer what was essentially an ad hominem attack against me. But, life goes on. I'm a big boy. I can take it. My concern was not with my own feelings or my own position. I was relatively protected as a tenured faculty member. I was more concerned about the effect of the president of UT's comments on people without that protection. So students, graduate students, especially those from other countries who might have felt particularly vulnerable. Untenured faculty who don't yet have job protection. I think the unfortunate part of President Larry Faulkner's critique of me was not just that it was intellectually empty. I mean, he didn't really offer a serious critique. He just called me a bunch of names. But that it signaled to others on campus that if you speak up and express a dissident point of view, you are not going to find the university as a shield so much. You're going to be at risk. And I think that led to a lot of people perhaps not speaking when they otherwise would have.
So that piece ran in the Houston Chronicle, I know, on September 14th, 2001. And in retrospect, and I think you had written it, and it appeared a couple other places the day after on September 12th. In retrospect, did you feel, or do you feel the timing of that might have been a little insensitive, or do you have any regrets about the timing of when you chose to write that piece?
No, I realized I wanted to write something by late in the afternoon on September 11th, so people might remember that the attacks happened in the morning. And like most people, it took a while just to sort of get my head around what had happened. I went to my office and watched the news reports. And by the end of the day, it seemed quite clear that policymakers in the United States, not only the Bush administration officials, but members of Congress as well, were going to advocate for what at the time I called a mad rush to war. And that's how I would still describe it. That the pain and the anger of that day were going to be used as a justification for wars that were about other things, not about keeping us safe, but about expanding U.S. power. And so I wrote that evening. It appeared on websites the next morning of September 12th, and as you pointed out, a couple days later in the Houston Chronicle. I don't think the timing of that was dictated by me. The minute I realized that policymakers were going to use this to pursue a war platform, I thought it was my obligation as a citizen and someone who objected to that to voice my opinion. So the timing was really, not mine. The timing was dictated by the politicians. And I thought to wait to speak was a tragic mistake because there needed to be voices counseling against war. And in fact, if you looked at the web the next morning on websites that typically reflect a progressive or critical view, mine was hardly the only one. There were others arguing that this mad rush to war was going to be ill-fated. And of course, it turned out that was the, I think, correct position. So if anything, I wish I had argued more strenuously in that first piece. When I look back on it, it's a very mild critique. Anytime you look back on a piece of writing, you can find ways to improve it, and I certainly could have improved it. But there's nothing significant that I would change in what I wrote or the timing of the writing of it.
So I think the fact that it appeared in the Houston Chronicle made it kind of high profile, and I think it also may have surprised some people that it appeared not in an Austin newspaper, but in the Houston Chronicle, which is a city that is typically considered to be much more conservative. And then also the fact that you've got, as we mentioned earlier, this newer piece in the Chronicle as well. What is your relationship with the Houston Chronicle? How did it get started that they ended up carrying your writing?
Well, I don't have a regular gig with any newspaper.
Right.
I write and submit pieces, and newspapers in Texas, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin have used opinion pieces of mine over the years. These are decisions made by editors on the fly, and there's nothing particularly complicated about it. It's just that the editor at Houston felt that was a voice he wanted on the editorial page. In later conversation with him, he said he knew it was going to be controversial. I don't think any of us would have guessed how much controversy it generated, but that was just sort of the way it worked out. I purposely write for as wide a range of publications as I can. I write for instance, websites that are sort of ideologically aligned with myself, websites that tend to reflect my point of view. I try to write for mainstream publications where there's a range of opinions. And if I had access to them, I'd write for conservative publications more often than any, because I think that's the place where the debate is most needed. So I guess I'm eclectic. I'll write for virtually any publication that wants to run something I've done.
What do you think it says? Is it a positive thing then that a mainstream corporate-owned publication like the Houston Chronicle, to continue with that example, will run your pieces? Do you think that's a positive sign in the current media landscape?
Well, I think, as is often the case, when we chart the question of freedom of expression and freedom of press, you see that it's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that there are signs that the United States, for instance, is a far more open culture than it was in the past. So if you go back to, let's say, the World War I era, basically 100 years before, no mainstream newspaper would have ever published a kind of critical essay like that. So that's a good thing. We've expanded the range of opinions that can be expressed within a mainstream publication. On the other hand, political movements are weaker in the United States than ever. And by political movements, I mean dissident, grassroots, popular movements. So the movement to oppose U.S. entry into World War I was a far livelier and more effective movement in some ways than the anti-war movements of today. So there's more space to express oneself in the mainstream, but the movements that are underneath that political point of view are probably weaker today. People in power find ways to try and control a population. I don't think that's a terribly controversial statement. Clearly, in authoritarian societies, we can see how that is. Whether it's Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, you can see how people in positions of authority, especially when that authority is highly centralized, will try to control their populations, try to contain dissidents. Well, that happens in democracies as well as in more authoritarian countries. Different methods, but it does happen. And so the fact that people in power push back against dissidents is not surprising. In the United States today, we're pretty fortunate. Those of us who would consider ourselves expressing dissident opinions have a pretty wide berth, but it doesn't mean that we're more effective in organizing against these, centralized powers. It just means that the culture has changed a bit, and in that sense, changed for the better.
So you've also written some pieces, some other controversial pieces people may be familiar with. One I'm thinking of involves Thanksgiving and your critical view of Thanksgiving and the way that it's celebrated and the reasoning that we celebrate it. Also, another piece I know you wrote criticizing UT football at the University of Texas, which is kind of sacrilegious in Austin. I'm curious, on a personal level, is there some part of you that enjoys being controversial or polemic?
That's a stupid question. I can't believe an idiot would ask a question like that. What do you mean, am I Are you suggesting I'm combative? Okay, that was a joke.
A little bit.
It's kind of funny. I really don't think of myself as an aggressive person. I think of myself as a pretty run-of-the-mill person from a pretty run-of-the-mill part of the world. I was born and raised in North Dakota. Not exactly a hotbed of radical thinking. I came to the positions that I hold on, let's say, U.S. use of force abroad, or the way we ignore the indigenous genocide on Thanksgiving, or the way that football programs, especially high-dollar football programs at universities like UT, can be very corrosive to the intellectual atmosphere on campus. Right? Well, none of those seem to me to be, quite frankly, very radical. They seem to be kind of observations about the way power works, the way historical memory works, the way that institutions operate. And so, I feel as someone who's a public servant in a sense. I'm an employee of the University of Texas, which means I work for the state of Texas. When I see there are ideas that are not being articulated, or I think I have a way to articulate ideas that might be useful in generating public discussion, it seems to me it's part of my job description to do that. Now, I know that some of those positions are going to make some people angry, but that's life in a democracy. That's what we should be aiming for. Frankly, everything I've ever written that generated controversy, I wouldn't have imagined it generating controversy when I first wrote it, with the one exception of the UT piece on UT football. When I wrote that, I thought, wow, this might get some people pissed off. And what's ironic is I had virtually no feedback from that article. It didn't circulate very widely. It was rejected by all of the mainstream publications I sent it to, including one where the editor thought it was quite a good piece but was not going to run it. It ended up running on a few websites and generated virtually no reaction. So I guess I'm batting zero so far. The pieces I write that end up generating controversy, I don't expect them to, and the one I thought would, didn't. So I'm not much of a predictor of my own effect on the world, apparently.
So one of the things that you mentioned was the fact that you are a tenured professor, you have this job protection, and you're free to pretty much do and say whatever you'd like without risking your job or putting your livelihood on the line. And I think just doing some reading online, I think that's one of the criticisms of you, is that people feel that you live in this kind of shielded, sort of sheltered lifestyle in which you don't have to worry about the ramifications of what you say, and that you maybe are out of touch with, your everyday working Joe who does have to worry about those kind of things, and that somehow that makes your viewpoints somehow less valid or taints them in some way. That seems to be kind of a recurring criticism of your writing that I find, at least online. But how would you respond to that type of criticism?
Well, there's two things I would say. First of all, before one debates whether or not, I'm connected to the real world or not,
right.
The first question is, are the opinions I'm articulating, are they valid? In other words, is there an argument there? Is the evidence I'm presenting credible? Before one gets into critiquing an author, it seems to me when we're writing about issues of public policy, whether to go to war, how to structure the university, the first and most important question is, do the ideas have merit? Well, if they don't have merit, then it doesn't matter who I am. You can, push aside ideas that have no merit. But interestingly, the people who make that criticism don't tend to engage the merit of the argument. So what about the ad hominem attack? Well, if in fact I were an academic who never ventured outside the university, I think there would be some legitimacy to that critique. In fact, I've often critiqued my own colleagues for being insufficiently connected to the struggles of the world. I think that's one of the obligations we have, not just as professors, but as human beings. And so, in fact, I actually spend a lot of my time outside the university, involved in a variety of projects. Currently, the two projects I'm most heavily involved in are support for one group that helps undocumented workers who are the subject of various kinds of fraud and work under often very dangerous conditions. So this organization tries to make sure that workers, especially immigrant workers without papers, are paid a fair wage for the work that they do and are not forced to work in hazardous conditions. Well, that puts me in contact with lots of working people. The membership of that group is overwhelmingly working people. I also work with a group that helps people who want to start worker-owned, worker-run businesses, worker cooperatives, a very exciting development in economics these days. Well, there we're working with folks who are trying to get a business off the ground, in other words, working people. So actually, if I'm forced to defend my own life, which I don't mind doing, again, I'm paid by the state of Texas, people have a right to ask me, I'm actually involved in a whole lot of activity with ordinary people. In fact, I tend to prefer the interaction I have outside the university. It's not to say I don't learn things on the university and don't have colleagues I respect, admire, and learn from. But I also find that my own understanding of the world is deepened dramatically by getting outside the campus, and I do that on a regular basis. But again, I think that to some degree that's all a diversion. The question is, are opinions that I assert, are ideas that I put out in public of any value? And that's where the debate should be, less on who I am and more on the ideas themselves.
One other criticism that I see time and time again of you is that you are anti-American or unpatriotic. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what your response to that is. Do you consider yourself to be patriotic? What is your response to the charge that you're anti-American? What does that mean to you?
Well, first of all, the charge that I'm anti-American is based on a simple misunderstanding of what democracy is. So let's return to some basic political theory here. In a democracy, the people are sovereign. That's a fundamental tenet of democracy. In other words, there is no authority above the people who can impose policies. All right. That means that, in a sense, in a democracy, everything's up for grabs. No policy can be determined to be correct by virtue of imposition. So to claim that I'm anti-American, let's say because I oppose the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan or the U.S. invasion of Iraq, is to simply misunderstand democracy. Democracy is about the debate that is supposed to be part of policy making, and that debate is supposed to include citizens. So, if somebody says, well, you're anti-American because you oppose a war, then I don't think they understand how we're supposed to go about the business of deciding whether or not we go to war.
Right.
There is no position that is American, and therefore one can be accused of being anti-American. Every position, it seems to me, needs to be debated. So anybody calling anyone else anti-American is just issuing a meaningless political insult, and I don't take it seriously. Patriotism is a more complex question. I have written quite clearly that I am not patriotic. If by patriotic we mean that I would express a love of or loyalty to the nation state. I'm a citizen of the U.S., the U.S. passport, but I don't feel patriotic. I do feel commitment to, love of, or loyalty to certain kinds of political principles. I'm a big fan of democracy. I'm a big fan of equality, of solidarity, of justice. But these are not principles that attach only to a nation state or even predominantly to the United States. I don't know how I can, have affection for or loyalty to a political unit. Now, I do have affection for and loyalty to lots of things within the United States. People, for instance. I have a lot of affection for certain people and loyalty to them, and I love the landscapes in certain parts of the United States. There's all sorts of things I feel, like any human being feels, about people and about landscapes, and I have a certain relationship to the history of these places. But none of that, to me, makes sense to express as patriotism. Now, that's at kind of a philosophical and somewhat abstract level. In a more sort of down-to-earth way, I see patriotism as usually an impediment to critical thinking, that when people claim that to be patriotic one must be acting in a certain way, what that usually is an attempt to derail the conversation that's essential to democracy, to derail critical thinking. And so I guess we could say I am philosophically opposed to the very idea of patriotism, and I see the dangerous way that patriotism is used in political discourse to try and undermine democracy.
So it's fair to say you're unlikely to have an American flag hanging from the stoop of your house. Is that fair to say?
I'm unlikely to have any kind of flag hanging from the stoop of my house. I don't feel connected to symbols like that. So yes, there's no American flag. There's no flag of the state of Texas. There's no flag of the state of North Dakota, my birthplace. There's no flag of Denmark, the birthplace of my grandfather. I don't feel connected to political units. I feel connected to ideas, to people, to places. But I don't express them through flags. I mean, I understand some people do, and I'm, not condemning it. I'm just wary of it and think there's room for this position. So I would say I'm not unpatriotic. Well, you're unpatriotic. And I say, no, I'm anti-patriotism. I'm against the concept. And that's, I think, an important position.
So one of the things I think that people who know you or spent some time with you or read any of your writing even is that you seem to take a very pessimistic view of the country, of our future. You've written some things, sort of suggesting that we're kind of doomed as a society or as a culture. Perhaps if we don't make some serious changes. I'm curious on a more personal level, do you find reasons to be happy? Do you see things in our society that do make you feel positive, or is it really as bleak as your writing and your teaching would lead people who have followed your material to believe?
Well, first of all, I think terms like pessimism and optimism really don't help us in this point. I think we need to be realistic about the conditions under which we live and are likely to live in the coming decades. Mm-hmm. That's how you make sensible plans for the future, is to confront reality. I happen to believe that the data is quite clear on this and that we're in trouble, yes. And so in that sense, I'm not optimistic about the future, especially the short-term future. There are really two aspects to this. One is the just basic question of ecological sustainability. You can think of the human species as, for the last 250 years, having been on a drunken bender in terms of energy. Ever since we started exploiting the incredibly concentrated energy of coal first, then oil and natural gas, first world societies especially, but in some sense the whole human species, has been on this kind of bender. We've been using levels of energy that no other period has had accessible to it, and we've done lots of interesting things with it, including, for instance, making the machines that you and I are now communicating on. But there's been a downside to that, and the downside, of course, is an increasingly unsustainable relationship between human beings and the world. Will that mean dramatic and catastrophic consequences tomorrow? Well, not in terms of the end of the world. But I think the consequences are in fact dramatic, and they are potentially catastrophic. And although no one can sit here and predict the time frame for that, I think the data is quite clear. And I don't think we do a service to ourselves or to anyone else or to the larger living world if we pretend that reality is not reality. So I think that, people often ask me, well, you don't have any hope. And my response is always the same. Hope is not something that comes down from the clouds and is given to us. I think we have reasons for hope when we demonstrate that we're competent to understand our place in the world and react to it intelligently. I think hope comes when people, for instance, organize in movements for social justice and inspire each other.
Does your mind allow you to take a step back from that bad news that's obviously there and appreciate things within your personal life, or is that pretty much there for you 24/7? I mean, throughout your waking hours, are these things you're thinking about?
No, I'm a miserable human being. I have no friends.
Just in general.
I've never had any pleasure over the last 20 years in life. No, of course not. I mean, one can hold in one's mind the kinds of facts we're talking about, and also recognize that, there's a joy to life that simply can't be suppressed. Joy in friendship, joy in love, joy in appreciating the arts. My wife happens to be a musician, so I'm constantly surrounded by a kind of beauty that is of great solace. So both things are true. I think about this stuff pretty much 24 hours a day, and there are lots of things in my life that I find, enriching, and lots of things I enjoy. I happen to like to cook. I often spend my entire day thinking about the collapse of the ecosphere and the end of human existence on the planet, and then I go home and have a lovely time chopping onions to cook. So both things are true. Human existence is about dealing with these wrenching realities that we can't escape, and also finding the joy in life. I always quote one of my favorite writers, Wendell Berry, the novelist and really articulate advocate for sustainable agriculture in the U.S. In his classic book, The Unsettling of America, Wendell said, face it, we live on what he called the human estate of grief and joy. In any one's life, we will experience grief that is beyond description and great joy. And that's our lot in life. This critical consciousness that human beings have with this incredibly big brain we have. It's, as it's always said, it's a blessing and a curse. It allows us to understand ourselves, understand the world in which we live in ways that, as far as we know, no other species can. And it also means that we are more aware of our own suffering than perhaps any other species, and especially aware of our own mortality.
And of course, one response to that for many people is religion, and I know you wrote a book on that topic and your kind of complex relationship with religion. As I understand it, you consider yourself an atheist, but you do participate and occasionally give sermons at a church in Austin. Could you just briefly summarize the sort of seeming dichotomy there and what that experience gives you?
Sure, although I should be clear, I don't have a complicated relationship to religion.
Okay.
Some people who are a member of the religion I belong to will say they have a complicated relationship with me, perhaps, but okay. I feel it's pretty straightforward. So the tradition of Christianity, the tradition I was born into and currently identify with, like any other world religion, does not have a single theology. The one thing you can know is anybody who claims to have the one right view of Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or anything misunderstands the nature of these faith traditions. They are complex. They have from the beginning spawned multiple interpretations. From the first, there was the concept of being Christian. There were debates about what that meant. And so I'm part of those debates today. I come from a tradition that's often called Christian atheist or Christian agnostic. By that, I simply mean I don't have supernatural beliefs. I don't believe that God is an actual being or a force or an entity that directs the world. I think of the term God as really being a synonym for mystery, for those things that are beyond our comprehension. I don't believe in the resurrection of Christ as a literal historical fact. Well, guess what? There are lots of Christians who don't believe either of those things. And so that tends to be what we call this agnostic or atheist tradition in Christianity. That is holding on to the text and the traditions, realizing that people make sense of the world in community, and that we need stories, and that sometimes stories from ancient times are very useful in that. And that's a conception of religion that's hardly unique to me. Lots of people embrace religion in that sense. So, I did write about this in ways some people found provocative, and it did create a little bit of controversy. But I'm a member in good standing of a mainline Presbyterian church here in Austin, Texas. I attend regularly. I sit in the pews and listen to very interesting sermons and enjoy my friends and allies who also go to church there. And, have a cup of bad coffee after church, all the things that make religion meaningful. And I think of all of those, of course, the bad coffee is the most important. That a church isn't really a church until there's a pot of substandard coffee on it.
But is it fair to say you're taking away something different from the experience than the rest of the churchgoers there?
Not at my particular congregation.
Okay.
The congregation I belong to happens to be dominated by people who think basically in the kind of same kinds of ways. That's in fact why I was attracted to that congregation. Now, within the Presbyterian Church USA, yes, there are many different interpretations.
Right.
And that's led some of those people to ask me, very bluntly, am I a real Christian? And my response is always the same. Can you tell me what a real Christian is? That is there one set of doctrines that you think adequately define the Christian tradition that's been with us now for a couple of thousand years? Well, anybody who makes that claim, again, is either arrogant or a little slow-witted, because it's impossible to take such a diverse tradition and pretend that there can be one particular articulation of it. And I think people who want to believe there can be that single articulation are among the most dangerous people in the world, because when you actually believe that you can take the complexities of theology and make a definitive statement about them, I think you're not only misunderstanding the importance of religion, but you're likely to do something stupid as a result. So I tend to be very afraid of people who make those kinds of claims.
Let me ask you this, taking a step back, talking about some of your views that have been considered provocative by some, or controversial by others, or sacrilegious, or quote-unquote anti-American. I'm just curious, do you ever fear for your personal safety? Does that ever concern you when you're thinking about the things that you're going to write or the opinions that you're going to express?
No, I mean, I'm not nearly important enough for anybody to bother with hurting physically. I mean, obviously, one doesn't have to, read deeply into the newspapers to realize that in this culture, there are people who will express their anger, resentment, violently. We've had a particularly visible rash of these recently. And so, of course, none of us are safe, but I don't feel like I'm at any particular risk. I live in a democratic society with a fairly rich tradition of debate and engagement, none of which prevents some crazy person with a gun from taking a shot at you. But I don't, feel that I rank very high on the list of potential targets. It's true that I've written and in public spoken about political positions that aren't the mainstream, but there are hundreds, literally thousands of people around the country doing the same thing. So if I'm scared of anything, it might be of that one student who I gave a low grade to who's going to take it out on me. I don't want to name any names about potential balanced former students, but, it is, I think a concern, but not one that's ever part of my thinking.
Talk to me a little bit about the link between your teaching role and your other roles. I know you've been a professor now for over 20 years. And so I know you have all these other sort of roles that you engage in as well, your writing, your activism, the various groups that you're involved with. Do you see all of these as being sort of distinct parts of your life, or would you say that they are all somehow intrinsically related to one another?
Well, I think all of these parts of my life, let's say I'm a teacher, I'm involved in political activity, I'm a writer, and then I'm, just an ordinary person too. Anyone who's taught for any length of time knows that it's hard to separate any of our roles. That is, things we learn in the course of everyday life, we often bring into the classroom, and I think that's appropriate. Things we might learn in church, let's say, we bring into the classroom. Often in religious contexts, we deepen our understanding of human nature. Things we learn in political engagement. All of those things are brought into the classroom. But that doesn't mean the classroom is a place to push one's own politics on students. It doesn't mean it's a place to proselytize for a certain religious point of view, nor is it a place to suggest that the way I live is the way students should live. So to recognize that teaching is an activity in which we draw on all of the complex ways in which we learn about the world is, it seems to me, fairly obvious, not terribly controversial to say. In other words, one way I've said this succinctly is all teaching has a politics. There are judgments we make when we design a course, when we decide what textbook to use, when we put together a lecture, when we answer student questions. There's always an underlying politics, and by that I simply mean a set of assumptions about how the world works and how it should work. But to say that all teaching has a politics isn't to say that teaching is nothing but politics. I can distinguish quite clearly between my role as, let's say, a political advocate in the community, in which I'm articulating a position and trying to get other people to agree with it. That's what politics is, after all. You assert your preference for a particular policy and you try to persuade others to join you. That's how you get things done in politics. That's the goal when I'm out in public. But in the classroom, I'm not aiming at getting students to agree with me. The goal is to help students develop their own capacity for critical thinking. It's that simple. The goal is not to get students to leave the classroom believing exactly what I believe, but to get them better equipped to do that thinking on their own. Now, I am sure that I make mistakes in the classroom. Everybody makes mistakes in everything we do in life. But I think over the years I've gotten pretty good at understanding the very important difference between those two roles. And the ultimate judge of that, of course, is my students, whether they feel that I'm proselytizing or pushing a politics down their throat. The way I try to make sure I never do that is by being very clear about the assumptions that I make when I go into a class, the nature of the evidence I'm using, and I try to make it clear whenever I'm stating a position like that there are many other positions. I wish I had $1 for every time I've said to a class, reasonable people can disagree. That is, people who want to, engage the world in a very serious way. People even with similar basic moral principles can come to different conclusions about what's appropriate. And that's important to remember. Reasonable people can disagree.
So in fact, I want to quote you from something you wrote, a piece on teaching here that on that very subject. You say, the objective is not to strong-arm students into agreement, but to explain those choices and defend them when challenged by students. At the end of a successful semester, students should be able to identify my assumptions, critique them, and be clear about their own. That was from a piece that you wrote earlier this year on education and journalism. So a final question. So you've been teaching, as we mentioned earlier, for over 20 years now. I'm curious, so you're someone who interacts with young people in their late teens, early 20s on a pretty much daily basis. What do you take away from your interactions with your students in terms of what does it tell you about sort of the state of young people?
Well, certainly young people haven't changed. People haven't changed. What's changed is the resources that the culture gives us to deal with problems. And there, I see the problem not in young people, but in all of us, that the culture is dramatically unable to give us those resources. What do I mean by that? I mean just the experience of dialogue and debate about political issues is atrophied. Again, not only among young people, but I see it even in my own generation. People are reluctant to talk about politics. People, when they do talk about politics, often don't know how to have a rational discussion based on evidence and logic. I mean, all of these things are problems, but not just for young people. So I think often folks like me who are older, I'm 54 years old, want to displace our own problems and our own responsibility for those problems onto young people. I find young people are young people pretty much unchanged, and they work with the tools that the culture gives them. And so my focus is on how the culture isn't giving us those tools, and we need to sort of take responsibility for creating them ourselves. So take the political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Many young people feel kind of disgusted with both parties, as do I. So we have to create new spaces for political activity, and I see young people doing that. I've mentioned several groups I'm working with in Austin, and they're populated mostly by young people. Now, young people, just like my own generation, are not, a unitary bunch, and a lot of young people are sort of collapsing into apathy and paralysis. But again, so are a lot of people of my own generation. They're apathetic. They feel nothing can be done, so they don't engage politically. Or they would like to, but they feel paralyzed by the overwhelming nature of the problems. So, I tend to focus on problems people in a culture have, not necessarily on one particular generation. And then we're back to where we started, is that the news is not good. The political and economic institutions are not serving our needs. In the same time, the health of the ecosphere, which is, after all, that which our own lives depend on, is in trouble. And I think we need to start by just recognizing all those problems and making a commitment to doing something. Now, what that something is, I'm not sure, but I always say that when you're not sure what to do something. Engage, get active. That's the way we start to create alternatives.
Well, Dr. Robert Jensen, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
Been a pleasure. Great questions and a great conversation. Thank you.